Hello everyone, welcome to this short video that's going to review Impressionist style. Impressionism is a movement that gets going in the 1870s and is going to be one of the first significant movements to really challenge the academic expectations for what art should look like and how art should be made. The movement has its beginnings when Renoir and Monet decide that they are going to spend the summer doing sketches outside. The term for painting outside in this manner in French is en plein air. Excuse my pronunciation. They were able to do this because, thank you, Industrial Revolution, to the new invention of oil paints in tubes. They had caps, they were portable, you didn't have to use it all at once, you didn't have to take a bulky jar. So using these new paints in tubes, Renoir and Monet decide that they're going to spend the summer doing these oil sketches out in nature. So when they were doing these, they really wanted to focus on the specific moment, the way the light was at that moment, the way the color was at the moment, the way the mood and the atmosphere of that moment. And so it's really an extreme of looking at the here and the now. But what we're going to see is that they wanted to really capture all of these things before they change very quickly. And that whole notion of quick change is something that is really indicative of modern society, whether it's quick change throughout the course of a day or quick change as society changes from one practice to another. We are going to see that from this point out, societies really expect and embrace and are used to incredible amounts of change. So for Impressionist artists, they begin to feel like they can change the expectations for how art should be made. And when Renoir and Monet come back from their summer sketching, they decide they like the sense of instantaneity that is a part of these works, and they want to investigate that sense of spontaneity. And that's really how Impressionism gets going. So Renoir and Monet are changing from the academic expectations of the past that felt like art should be created in a very controlled way in the studio. They're changing from the expectations of what art should look like, and we'll be talking about all of these characteristics of Impressionist style that are very different from what the French academic tradition expected. And they also changed the expectation for the subject matter of art, because for Impressionism, their subjects usually aren't moralizing, they usually don't have political connotations, they usually aren't based in mythology or in the classical past or in really grand moments from history, as academic painting was. Instead, Impressionism really looked to landscapes, to bourgeois recreation, and we have to remember that this is the time frame of the Second Industrial Revolution. Trains and railways are much more extensive than they have been in the past. There's a greater expectation for leisure time and kind of set leisure times and the new kind of work regulations of the age. So people have time off. People have access to the countryside through these railways, thanks to the Second Industrial Revolution. So we see a lot of landscapes. We see a lot of people out in nature in their free time, enjoying their time off of work. And that's a very different subject from what the academic tradition expected. When we look at this list of other characteristics of Impressionism, you can see we've already kind of addressed the first three. What I do want to kind of point out is with these subjects, honestly, the subjects themselves, the landscape itself, isn't very important to the Impressionists. But what really they're doing is they're using that landscape to focus on the moment, the way the light and the color and the mood and the atmosphere was at that moment. That becomes the true subject of Impressionism. Since they are trying to focus on a moment, they paint very quickly. They use what is called an Impressionist brushstroke. It's very different from the academic approach, which had a lot of control and really focused on a very smooth brushstroke that would kind of disappear on the canvas and create a very fine finish. And as they paint quickly, they also are taking less time to model the color and model lights and darks. And they start to embrace these ideas from Chevreul, who's a Frenchman who had spent time studying color and had published his color theories. We'll talk more about that in a moment. But essentially, the way that they embraced these color theories made it possible for the Impressionists to put their paint down more quickly on the canvas and spend less time modulating that color. Since they were painting in such a new way, they really weren't accepted in academic circles. Luckily, we had some alternatives to the Academy that were becoming more popular during the time of Impressionism. We had some that preceded the Impressionists. We even have the Pavilion of Realism with realism. Listed here, we see the Salon des Refuses that was put together in the 1860s. And then the Impressionists themselves begin exhibiting away from the Academy. They call themselves the Société Anonyme. And eventually, this group of artists exhibiting together will kind of morph into this Salon des Indépendants. And so we've got these two different alternatives to the Salon during the time of Impressionism. We also are going to see that galleries become much more popular at this time historically, much more prevalent at this time historically. And those too will offer alternative spaces for artists to show their works, to sell their works that are outside of the Academy. That means the Impressionist artists don't have to follow the academic rules for how art should look any longer so that they can show their works and sell them. Instead, they can pursue something that is more individualized. They can pursue something that is more avant-garde. We're going to talk a little bit about how the Japanese aesthetic really started to influence the way Impressionists approached composition and space in the works. I will talk about that in more detail in a moment. But what we have to understand is that they're doing these things intentionally. That really is part of the modernist mentality, right? That they are moving away from what the academic expectations are in order to pursue a different direction. So let's take a minute to just give a few details about what Chevreul was saying for art. The first thing he's kind of saying that is influential for the Impressionists is he talks about what he calls optical mixing. Sometimes this is also called broken color. Essentially, when you see two colors next to each other from a distance, your eye will blend those together. If you were to see red next to blue, if you saw that from far enough away, your eye would register purple. Another thing that's influential to the Impressionists is the idea of simultaneous contrasts. And there's kind of two different parts of this rule. Essentially, the idea is that colors themselves are surrounded by this faint halo of the complementary color. We don't really notice it, but when we put complementary colors next to each other, those faint halos just serve to make the colors more vibrant in and of themselves. Part of this rule also is that the retina retains a little bit of that complementary color. So if you see these two flags, if you look at the flag on the left, the green, black, and yellow flag, you look at that little white dot. While I talk about this next rule, what you'll see is that you'll see the impression of the complementary colors kind of retains a little bit of themselves in your retina. And when you look over at the other side, you're going to see those complementary colors appear. So you've probably looked at this flag on the left long enough. Switch over to the flag on the right, and you should see a red, white, and blue flag instead. The third rule from Chevreul that was very influential on the Impressionists is this idea that black doesn't exist in nature, but that black is actually made up of other colors. So black is not a primary color, essentially, but it's made up of other colors. We're going to see that the Impressionists employ all of these different approaches to color in their works. Another contemporary idea that was influential on the style of Impressionism is Japonisme. It's this whole fascination with Japanese aesthetic. Essentially, Japan was opened up for trade in the 1850s by Commodore Perry, and over the next few decades, we start to see this influx of Japanese goods coming into Europe. The goods are usually wrapped in Japanese prints. Japan had a very strong print culture, and those prints themselves became really widely available. They were pretty cheap in contrast to the more expensive goods that they were used to wrap. As artists begin to see these, sometimes the prints and the goods were shown, in shops or in personal collections, but we had even private kind of places where these were shown. There was a pavilion at the World's Fair of 1867 from Japan. There was also in 1890 a landmark exhibition of Japanese woodcuts. So there were public places for artists to see these works as well. And in fact, a lot of cafe owners would kind of sell these Japanese prints on the sides, and cafe culture was really strong. Impressionist artists were out in the cafes. They could even see Japanese artworks there. As they were more aware of these kinds of artworks, they really were fascinated by this whole artistic tradition that was so different from the expectation of art in the West, that was so different from this notion that stems all the way back to Alberti and the Renaissance that art should be a window on the world. That was still firmly entrenched in the French academic tradition, even at this stage in history. And so the Impressionists saw that there were other alternatives, there were other goals, there were other aesthetics out there in the world that did not agree. It gave them kind of a sense of justification in pursuing these new directions in art. So when we look at these two examples from the left, we see Maternal Caress by Mary Cassatt from 1891, and on the right from 1790, Mother and Sleepy Child from Utamaro. You can see how much this Japanese aesthetic has crept into this Western artist's approach to style. And it really helps us to understand why these Impressionist artists were drawn to different types of compositional tools. Some of those that really impact Impressionism, a sense of flatness becomes very prominent. Asymmetrical compositions, different kinds of balances than what we're used to seeing. Tilted perspectives, and that kind of goes hand in hand with that sense of flatness. An emphasis on line and an emphasis on the decorative kind of potential of line is definitely something we see as well. We also see an embrace of negative space in a way that we don't really see in the Western tradition. So these Japanese kinds of characteristics start to creep their way into Impressionism, and in fact will also influence the following movement of post-Impressionism. In this example from Renoir, you can see a number of elements that we associate with Impressionism. First of all, the subject matter. Remember the leisure activities of the working classes, these types of bourgeois recreation, their free time that they had. This was a very common subject for the Impressionists. And of course, we're seeing these bourgeois individuals out in nature, outside, enjoying the fresh air. Renoir is one who's specifically really known for his approach to painting outside, painting on plein air, and to capturing the effects of being outside. The really kind of luminous effects of light are definitely shown here. So this was a cabaret hall where they had dances every Sunday afternoon, and it had been very popular since the middle of the 19th century. We're seeing here kind of some relaxed rules of etiquette that are starting to spread during the era. The women are shown without hats, which was kind of breaking away from protocol. But this was also the time period when women started riding bikes and starting to wear different kinds of skirts to accommodate that. Also, the fact that they don't have hats not only reflects kind of changing expectations for dress, but also changing expectations for morals among the working class women. More women were out working in the shops and the store, and a lot of time the traditionalists in this era felt like that was only for loose women, right, that would be kind of out in the public like that. And in fact, these two women that are really prominent in the center are a famous actress and her sister. So that's kind of an example of these women that were out in public and kind of breaking away from expectations of what women should be allowed to do. Not only is it Impressionist in terms of its subject matter, but also in terms of its style. So this one here is a really great example of the Impressionist kind of approach that focuses so heavily on the spontaneity of the moment. How does the light feel at the moment? What is the color like at the moment? What is the atmosphere and the mood like at this moment? I'm going to paint very quickly, Renoir is saying, with an Impressionist brushstroke, so I can try and capture that sense of that instantaneous moment. So it's very lively in the way that it focuses on this spontaneity. He also embraces a lot of elements that we see coming from Chevreul and his expectations for colors. So he uses optical mixing here, or broken color, just pushing the colors next to each other and letting our eye blend and do the work. He uses blacks made up of all other colors, not out of just a flat black. And he also uses the idea of creating more vivid colors by placing them next to each other with those ideas of simultaneous contrast. Not only does he embrace these color theories from Chevreul, but he also shows other Impressionist elements like the influence of Japonisme. So here we're getting a greater sense of flatness. We're getting a different type of balance and composition, and instead of being really centered, it is a little bit more asymmetrical. We're getting a sense of cropping on the sides. We're getting a sense of kind of unusual tilted perspectives. These are all elements that come from that Japanese tradition. Okay, now this work, it is about 4.5 feet by roughly 5.5 feet. It was exhibited with the 1877 Impressionist show. So these shows, again, were really significant because they offered opportunities for artists who were pursuing original kinds of directions to still be able to show their art and succeed financially. This detail beautifully shows that Impressionist brushstroke that's a little sketchier, that's a little more hastily applied, very different from the academic finish that was smooth and controlled. It also is a really beautiful example of the Impressionist use of color. So when we look at the shoulder here of the figure, he has his arm up over the chair. You can see that it's not flat black, but it's this combination of other colors coming together to create black, to create the kind of highlights of the light as it filters through the leaves of the tree and kind of illuminates the different spots of his shoulders. Not only are we seeing the following of Chevreul's idea that there's no black in nature, but we're also seeing colors placed next to each other, right? Broken color or optical mixing. You can see that in the chair. You can see that in the clothing of other figures. So rather than finely modeling the colors and really blending them carefully, they just place one color next to the other and they let your eye do the work. Okay, we even have, increased vibrancy of colors by putting complementary colors next to each other, and that really creates more vivid types of colors. Our next example is the Rehearsal from 1874 by Edgar Degas. Degas often exhibited with the Impressionists, but he did works that were different slightly in his approach. He does use quite a few Impressionist elements, but he does step away from Impressionist expectations at the same time. He does a lot more sketches. He does a lot more painting in his studio. He uses black. So there are some real differences there. His subject matter can be very different as well from the Impressionists. But there are things from Impressionism that he does embrace. He uses an Impressionist brushstroke. He really focuses on that instantaneous kind of moment. What is the light, color, and atmosphere like at this moment, right? And those become a heavy focus for the Impressionists, so much so that in many works, that is really the whole purpose of the work, is to explore that spontaneous moment and the light and the color and the mood of that moment. Like the Impressionists as well, he uses elements from Chevreul's rules about color. He does juxtapose colors and use optical mixing. And even though he does use that Impressionist brushstroke, overall his works can be less sketchy. For instance, here when we look at the stairwell over on the left, or the balustrade, staircase, whatever you want to call it, it is much more defined and much less sketchy than some of the other passages in the work. Where he really starts to embrace an Impressionist approach is the way that he is fascinated by the Japanese aesthetic, by Japanisme. When we look at Degas' works, we can see that impact clearly showing through. We know that Degas was one who was exposed to the Japanese prints in the tea rooms and the cafes and the spice shops. We know that he was one of the first artists to start collecting these prints in France. And we have to just remember these prints were pretty affordable. They were something that the artists could afford to purchase, even when artists couldn't afford to purchase the luxury goods that came within the prints. So when we look here, we can see that Japanese influence creeping in. And Degas and the other Impressionists really felt like this was a way to be avant-garde. This was a way to be more sophisticated, to step away from the Western expectation that art needs to be a window on the world. The camera now can do that. Why should we as artists? Let's do something different. So here, I think one of the biggest things we can see right off the bat is negative space. Or we get this big empty spot of floor. Another thing that's really immediately obvious is the sense of this kind of tilted perspective. That comes from the Japanese aesthetic as well. We have a sense of asymmetrical balance, also something we expect to see from the Japanese kinds of influences. And we have a sense of cropping. So all of these things together with like the flatness and the abstraction, these are elements that artists were exposed to when they saw these Japanese prints and really embraced as a way of moving in a new kind of direction. We just need to remember they're not interested in embracing Japanese motifs and Japanese objects, but it's more the aesthetic. What's really fascinating about Degas and the way he approaches his subject matter of ballerinas is how he very often shows them in a kind of unidealized view. Sometimes they're crouching, sometimes they're tired, sometimes they're relaxed, sometimes they're in really awkward kinds of positions. And we know that he was really fascinated by dancers. He does over like 1,500 works surrounding the ballet and the stage, and these were rarely commissioned. So it's kind of fascinating the way that he approaches these women as subjects in a different way than idealizing them in an academic kind of way. So he would sketch these at the opera house or at the studio, then he'd return to his own studio and paint, which was very different from the other Impressionists. Our last example is Berthe Morisot, her villa at the seaside. She was the only woman to contribute to the first exhibition of the avant-garde Impressionist group at that 1874 opening show of the Société Anonyme. She painted this picture actually the next summer. She sold this one through a gallery, even though she was showing with the Impressionists at other exhibitions. The subject here is her sister Edma and her sister Edma's daughter at the seaside. Morisot actually went along with her on this trip. She ended up getting engaged on this trip, as a matter of fact. But it's just the kind of subject matter we'd expect from Impressionism. First of all, it is women, and we know that we have more subjects of women within Impressionism, women doing everyday, normal kinds of things rather than being so objectified as they had in other past works. Not only is it women, but it is bourgeois recreation, right? The upper middle class or the working class, even out in nature, are very common subjects for the Impressionists. We just have to remember that these kinds of countryside scenes or seaside scenes, these are the places that were more accessible now to people because of the railroads of the time. Not only is it a good example of the Impressionist type of subject matter, but it also shows Impressionist style. So, of course, the main emphasis here, the main subject here is really the instant moment in time. How is the light at that instant moment in time? How is the color? How is the mood? What's the atmosphere like? And of course, many of these Impressionists are using an Impressionist brushstroke to work really rapidly and try and capture all of that before it changes. So working very quickly, and of course, usually working on plein air, working outside, doing a lot of the painting itself out in the open air. Morisot is also showing Impressionist elements in the way that she's influenced by Japonism. So we have a sense of flatness here. It's not too extreme, but it's definitely present. We have some abstraction. We do have some emphasis on negative space. We have some asymmetrical balance. And here also, even though it's light, we do have a little bit of tilted perspective. So these Impressionist artists were really fascinated by the Japanese aesthetic, by this alternative to the Western world's opinion that art should be a window on the world, and Morisot shows that here.